Good, ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? And while we're finishing our wonderful service, and once again thanks to the catering staff of the Midland Hotel for moving us along very rapidly, exactly on time, before we begin the program and my opportunity to introduce Gigi Geyer, we have a book table up here. We have her splendid new book, Americans No More. And I hope that you will avail yourself of it. After we conclude our program at about 1:40, Gigi will be available to sign the book. And then also, you will remember buying The Night Flight, a wonderful book. We will have copies of that available as well. So with that, we're ready to begin our program, and it's our great pleasure to introduce our dear and good friend, Georgianne Geyer. We have two options, a 40-minute introduction or almost no introduction whatsoever, and let's do the latter. Georgianne Geyer.
Thank you so much. You know, I remember when my beloved mother was alive and I would come back to Chicago and she would say, well, dear, whom did you interview on this trip? And I'd say, well, Mom, Gaddafi, Khomeini, Castro, and Arafat. And she would kind of flinch and she'd say, well, dear, I don't like to interfere in your life, but I really don't approve of the company you're keeping. You know, I'm from the south side of Chicago, 83rd and Ada Street. Was born and raised there, and I give our mothers a lot of credit for understanding anything about foreign policy, because our mothers were very ladylike, but they were also, they were very realistic. They would say to us, now girls, most of the men out there are wonderful men, they're like your fathers and your brothers, but they're bad. And I've always said that our mothers taught us where to kiss, why. And I think that's a very rule to remember when we're dealing with foreign policy. And unfortunately, we've had for the last few years quite a bit of not knowing where to kick and not knowing why either. You know, somewhere along the way here, I got into the dictator business. And Fidel Castro and Khomeini and Juan Perón before he died in Argentina. And I began to look, particularly when I wrote my Castro book, I began to these men that that I've been reading about in history, the charismatic dictators or the charismatic authority, as Weber calls them, about what they had in common. And I found that they had a great many things in common. They had to be distant, mythological. They couldn't be seen to be doing anything normal like tying their shoelaces. And then there was another quality. They never paid for anything. Money never crossed their palms. Now, until I wrote my Castro biography, I thought that that was a trait that was restricted to my former fiancés. But no. Oh, yeah. You've had fiancés like that, too. At any rate, I was covering the world first for the Chicago Daily News and then the last 20 years for my syndicated column. And I've seen a lot of really wonderful things. But the world that I was covering from the 1964 onward, when I went overseas, was also a world that where we didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know in the 60s when I was covering Latin America and covering then Russia, Middle East, the rest of the world, Vietnam 4 times and so on. We didn't know whether communism was going to win or Marxism in much of the third world. We didn't know if American democracy or free enterprise was going to be the predominant choice of the world. And then one day in 1987, I had an interview, and of course the world had so changed by then, but the interview showed us exactly the way the world was going. It was December of 1987. It was the week that President Reagan was meeting in Washington with Russian President Gorbachev. They were meeting all week long, and there were like 5,000 journalists from all over the world in town, and I didn't even call the White House or apply for anything because I hate those kinds of mob scenes. Well, that Monday morning, about 10 o'clock, I was in my apartment where I work, and I got a call, and they said, "Hello, Ms. Geyer, this is the White House." And I said, "Hello, White House," which is what you say when you're a well-brought-up young lady in the South Side. And they said, "We'd like you to come at 2 o'clock Wednesday for an interview." And I said, "Fine, okay." I said, "Well, with whom is it?" And they said, "Oh, it's with President Reagan. He's going to meet with 4 of you columnists." Well, I was, of course, ecstatic. Here, 4 of us were going to break the logjam for reasons we didn't know and see President Reagan in this very, very important week. Well, I got there about 1:30, and I was quite excited, and there were 3 men and me. Well, immediately one of the men, they're all good friends of mine, said to me, "Gigi, why do you think we were chosen?" Well, you know, I have to pause here and say that I actually think it's a lot easier being a woman, because I never have to wonder why I was chosen. You know, I don't lie awake nights wondering about it. You know, it's not a terrible stress on me. If I saw one of those guys on the street today in Washington, he'd say hello, and then he'd say, "Why do you think we were chosen?" So I think it's really easier being a woman, because I know why I was chosen. So at 2 o'clock exactly, we went in to see President Reagan, and Ronald Reagan came out, and he looked fabulous. He was slim and handsome and beautiful suit. I mean, he looked on the top of the world. And, you know, he was about 94 then. And I immediately looked at the roots of his hair. His hair was not dyed. Mine was. We got that out of the way. And then we sat down. Well, about 5 minutes into the interview, which went on for about half an hour, one of the men, one of my colleagues, said to him, "Well, now, Mr. President, what about, you've got Mikhail Gorbachev here, you've got the evil empire right here. What are you going to do next with them?" And Reagan said, "Oh, no, no." He said, "No, you don't understand." He said, "We're friends now. We're not enemies anymore." He said, "You know, they no longer believe in one world Marxian domination." And he had that kind of odd wording there. Well, we kind of looked at one another, but we said, no, he doesn't mean that. Because God bless him, but he did say some goofy things at times. And another 5 minutes, and one of the other guys said to him, "Now, Mr. President, what are you going to do with the Russians next? They still have all these nukes, et cetera, et cetera." Reagan said, "Oh, no, no, you don't understand. That's past. That is completely over." He said, "You know, they no longer believe in one world Marxian domination." Well, now we were getting a little worried. And then about 5 minutes later, I asked still another similar question, and the president said, "Oh, no, Georgianne, that's a past now. This is a new era." He said, "They no longer believe in one world Marxian domination." Well, ladies and gentlemen, when I went out of the Oval Office that day, I said to one of the other journalists, I said, "You know, I have a terrible feeling that we just heard the announcement of the end of the Cold War." And indeed, so we had, because you can really trace it from that moment as well as any other one. You could say, well, 1985 when Gorbachev came in and began to change things. You can say 89 when the wall went down, or you could say 91 when the Soviet Union was officially dismantled. But really it was that week of December of 87. And I was, ladies and gentlemen, I was thrilled. I was breathless with excitement, because everything that I had been covering, everything that we'd been living through in our lives was related to the Cold War, to this terrible, longevous conflict, ideological, military, political, economic. Every place I went in the world, whether it was Angola, whether it was Vietnam, whether it was Salvador, whether it was the Middle East, we were fighting parts of the Cold War. And I was tremendously excited. I thought this was enough to have lived for. This was enough to have designed one's life for. So I was very excited, and I wrote it as a straight news story. Actually, I said, President Reagan Thursday announced the end of the Cold War. I must say the three men journalists didn't get it. They they did what we call backing into the story, or they did second-day stories, you know, analyzing before they told what had happened. So you couldn't tell from their stories what had happened. But I shouldn't have said that, because they're really very nice guys. And they had all of these stresses and strains on them, besides, you know, wondering why they were chosen. So we don't want to do too much for them. At any rate, ladies and gentlemen, that was the day of all my interviews that I will really remember. But before I go on from that point, I have to tell you my favorite story about Ronald Reagan, because he was a very charming man, and God bless him. He still is with us. But, you know, he didn't work long hours. And if he was in by 9:30, 10, that was good, and he was out by 4:30. And I must say, the older I get and the longer hours I work, the smarter I think he is. But one day they were joking with him in the White House, some of his staff, and about his short hours. And he looked at them and he said, with that kind of cute cocked head, the way he would cock his head, he said, "They say that hard work never hurt anybody, but gee, why take a chance?" But ladies and gentlemen, where do we go from there? Why am I bringing up this end of the Cold War moment at the time when we're really talking about the death of citizenship in America? Well, because I think that focuses us on where we really are today. We're in a very odd quandary, this country, this magnificent country. We are preeminent in the world, as no country really has been in most of history. We are the greatest military power. Our economic theories are accepted by the whole world as the desirable ones. Democracy or representative government is transcendent. When Alexander Lebed, the general, was in Washington 2 weeks ago, one of the things that touched me about him was he started out his speech to some of us at the Council on Foreign Relations by saying, "We fought a long, cold war, and you won." And I kind of gasped. I thought, I never thought I would hear a Russian official, much less a general, saying that, and so clearly. And I don't remember the exact quote. I used it in my article, my column. But he said, "You had the longer breath," was the word he used. And essentially what he said was, "You were the modern nation," and he says that all the time. So here we are in this quandary, ladies and gentlemen, because we are the preeminent country in the world. We've won this very long war, which I think a lot of Americans did not understand in its complexity. We did it without going into a major war, outside of course, Vietnam, which was a derivative war. And yet we find today that there is dissatisfaction in America, that we don't know where we're going next, that we don't know what our values are, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of my colleagues will say, "Oh, we missed the Cold War, we don't have an enemy." And I have never accepted that. I don't accept it because if you look back through history, it's when countries or empires were doing their most productive, creative work that they were also most powerful. I don't need an enemy to make me get up and write my column in the morning. I've got enough enemies, but I don't need an enemy. I don't buy that. I think it's something else. I think we're exhausted by the Cold War, as is Europe, as surely are the Russians and much of the world. But also, I think we have let slip internally what it is that holds us together as Americans. Incidentally, Dick, I was listening to public radio just before I came, and our old friend Marvin Zonas, the University of Chicago professor, was speaking on a similar thing about our core values and how the Cold War exhausted them. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is how I got from covering the world and covering this longevous conflict to the death of citizenship in America. Well, a lot of my friends say, "How did you do that? You're an international correspondent. You're supposed to be out there in all these goofy places with all those goofy people." And I am. And there were enough goofy people on the South Side, too, I can tell you that. But how did I get into it? I began to look at our borders. And I began to take that as part of my duty or my assignment, my mission, my mandate. Then I began to see the effects of massive population movements all over the world. And I began to ask the question, well, nations are going to have to decide who belongs in this modern world. Who belongs where, and why? And then I began to look into citizenship. So, well, let's look at the positive. Let's not look at the negative. Let's look at the positive. And I began to look at citizenship. Well, that was where I found some of the really stunning things that I have found in my book, Americans No More. Let me give you first the overview, the larger picture of what I felt that I found in this book. I found essentially that we are losing our core principles as a society. Now, this is not new. A lot of people are saying this. William Bennett is one who says it brilliantly in Washington all the time. But I was unprepared for all of the ways that we are allowing them to be distorted or perverted, or the way we're really throwing them away. American principles, remember, ladies and gentlemen, at this moment in history are preeminent in the world. I'm invited to civic education conferences in Czechoslovakia, in Moscow, in Southeast Asia, and we are not teaching civics or American history in our own schools to our own children. This is only one of the many, many strange things that's going on. On the one side, on the right, you have the globalized economy people who say, we're not citizens of any nation. The nation state is finished. We are a globalized economy. Citizens are consumers, nothing more. Then you have, now those are the elites and the people who should be protecting and projecting our values. Then on the left, you have the multiculturalists and the politically correct who really do want to change this country and really are changing this country. And their vision is a world broken down into group rights, which are essentially ethnic, which are religious, which are gender, which are racial, which are all the things that I wanted to get away from in this country, all the things I thought we were fighting against, with civil rights, with freedom for women, etc. They are pseudo-Marxists. They have an overarching philosophy, which they are giving to our universities and to much of our public life. In fact, today, the Supreme Court began hearings, I wrote about this in yesterday's columns, on English as a national language, just one of many, many areas of this big spectrum that I'm talking about. So you have the far right and the far left. The far left, largely of interest groups, activist groups, sponsored by the big corporations, big foundations, like Ford Foundation, who gives tens of millions of dollars to them. They bypass the democratic process and make the changes in the courts. I go into this in some detail in the book. I know I was not aware of it when I started writing this. Then I got into citizenship and the testing, and citizenship as civics. Well, let me give you, ladies and gentlemen, the question 86 on the citizenship test. First, let me say citizenship tests today are a fraud. They are just a fraud. And I've said this to the head of the INS, and I prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. People will get one or two questions like, what is the capital of the United States? Who was the first president? No context, nothing that will have them believe in or understand the principles of this country. But question 86 says, give 3 reasons to be an American citizen. There are only 3 reasons. Please don't talk to me about Jefferson or about Madison or about Lincoln, because the only 3 answers to that question are to get a federal job, to get a passport to travel abroad, and to bring my relatives here. And this is so typical of the entire citizenship process. It's benefits, benefits, benefits. It's what can we give to you? What can you ask more? I do not blame the immigrants at all. It is not their fault. It is our fault, because we have so dumbed down every principle of this country. There's so many more things, ladies and gentlemen. We used to forbid dual citizenship. Now it's the norm. We used to forbid Americans from serving in foreign armies, much less as heads of state. We now have had a prime minister of Serbia. We've had the head of the Estonian army, who was an American general. These kinds of conflicted loyalties are now the norm. We now have, and this is the thing that really shocks Americans, non-citizen voting. Now you will say to me rightly, Georgianne, you're crazy. Non-citizens cannot vote. And you're right. That doesn't mean that they don't vote. The one TV channel in Chicago, as early as 1982, did a long series showing all you have to do is get a library card. Then you get a driver's license. You don't even have to speak English to get a voting card. And of course, language division is what has doomed countries all through history. People are voting all over the country, ladies and gentlemen, who are illegal. The Los Angeles Examiner, at least 8 years ago, did a study and found that 20-some Congress people owed their positions to the non-citizen vote. Then this year, I finished the book on March 1, and I was doing a lot of research into possible fraud because the INS, Immigration Naturalization Service, was pushing so many new citizens through at breakneck speed with no civic education, often no language capacity, and 1.3 million this year compared to 300,000 last year. So it did occur to my evil South Side of Chicago mind that perhaps there was some political purpose here, which was underneath the surface, but not very far. Well, it turns out I wasn't cynical enough at all. They were doing this, the administration was doing this very deliberately, and the Chicago Tribune has done wonderful work here, bringing out the memos saying from the Vice President's office saying they should do this, showing how at Soldier Field, where 11,000 new citizens were pushed through in August, how they were handing out citizenship certificates from cardboard boxes and not even collecting green cards. It has been a major, major scandal in Washington. And of course, it just built upon what I had discovered in my book. Now, ladies and gentlemen, where does that fit in? The dumbing down of our citizenship process, the defining down of the principles of our country. Again, and remember, these are not very onerous principles. It's the principles of the United States that you believe in a system of political representation which will be constantly approved by the voters. You will accept the results of the vote. You will serve in certain positions in jury duty. You will always also serve the country in times of war and insecurity. These are not very onerous principles. And there are no principles that say that you can't have your own religion, your own language, your own cultural celebrations. I'm from the South Side. Every neighborhood was different, every church, every synagogue. That's not what we're talking about, and that's not what the multiculturalists are talking about either. So how do we go from there then, ladies and gentlemen, to the bigger world? And let me just make a few points of where we are before we go into questions in the rest of the world. I'd like to make just a few points that follow from the end of the Cold War and from the losing of principles in the American polity to what is happening elsewhere. Let's start with Russia itself, because it is so important. Russia, interestingly enough, has gone through a similar process, but much, much, much more dramatic and much more serious. They have totally, at the end of the Cold War, lost their guiding principles. They're a messianic people. Remember, they were the Third Rome, they were the seat of orthodoxy, and they were communism, which was to save the world, not just rule the world, but save it. Well, today they don't believe in anything. And I've been in Russia, 3 times in the last year, including the elections, and you find a people who are just so terribly depressed. Now, what's going to happen there, ladies and gentlemen? They are breaking down into what they call clans. And that's a word, it's the same word in Russia, strangely enough. And you now have clans of power that are ruling Russia. One of them is the big oil and gas monopoly. And Chernomyrdin, the prime minister, went from being the minister of gas and oil to being the owner of gas and oil. Well, it doesn't take too much to figure out. You know, when I was there in 1992, when I went out to Central Asia, they had put Russia up for sale. Literally, everything was up for sale. Well, who had the money? The mafia had the money, or the big ministers had the money. And the ministers did things like shares were given out to the people in the factory. Well, they just wouldn't pay the people in the factory for 6 months. And of course, they'd sell their shares to the minister. That's why Chernomyrdin is now the owner of gas and oil, one of the wealthiest men in the world. Then you have the dacha, where Yeltsin was. Yeltsin had 40,000 men in a militia out at his dacha, surrounded by these people like General Korzhakov, the KGB general. There, I asked our ambassador, Tom Pickering, in June, I said, Mr. Ambassador, how many regular soldiers are there around Moscow? And he said, about 50,000. So you can see what's happening there is a breakdown militarily. I asked General Lebed, I was at 2 sessions with him, and I like this man very much. He's very funny. I mean, he's got a very good sense of humor. For instance, when they asked him about aid to Russia, and he thought for a moment and he said, the only free cheese is in a mousetrap. and after the elections, in June, it came out, you know, the first day he was named to the head of the Security Council. It was just one thing after that. It was a wonderful time to be there. But several weeks before, the Yeltsin people had come to him, and they were backing him at that time to get his second vote. And they came to him and they said, the president, Yeltsin, would like you to be the vice chairman in charge of all the security forces, i.e. the military, the police, and the intelligence. And Lebed's answer was, a vice chairman like that doesn't need a president. But in seeing him in Washington, when he started out, as I say, by saying that they had lost the Cold War, which I never thought I'd really hear any Russian say, I asked him the only question that really, he's very stolid, he looks straight ahead, he doesn't really acknowledge people, it's very almost an automaton-like quality. And the only question that really upset him was the one I put to him. And I said, General Lebed, is the Russian military in threat from these various militias that are forming? And you could see it jarred him. He really did not want to answer that question because, of course, he's been saying, and he had just said that day, the military is falling apart. They're not being paid. They're not respected. They're desperate. They're hungry. They're not even being fed. And I could see that the militia question was a very important one to him. Now, what is going to happen in Russia, ladies and gentlemen? Years and years, probably another generation, if it can right itself then, because now the process of criminalization, ownership of the economy by the mafia, and criminalization on every level has just gone so terribly far. China, I would watch China very, very carefully. Of course, it's been terribly, terribly mishandled the last 4 years. The Chinese are not hard to deal with. You just have to have a very constant hand with them. You have to be very, very straight with them in public, and whatever you want to do, you do with them in private. Well, we've done it exactly the opposite way. I hate to say this, but I expect the worst from China, particularly in Hong Kong. There are no indicators whatsoever of a liberalized approach on the part of China. In fact, what is happening is the economic progress there and prosperity is feeding their old ideas of not going out in an aggressive manner toward their neighbors, but becoming powerful enough and truculent enough that you will just rule the entire Asian area. Latin America, I see one thing happening there that really scares me, and there are many, many good things happening. They have made a real change toward free enterprise. They're mostly democracies now, but the area that absolutely terrifies me is what is happening in Colombia and what is secondarily happening in Mexico, right on our borders. Colombia, according to every report I have, is falling to a union of the old leftist guerrillas, the old Castroite guerrillas, back to my friend Fidel, who are resurgent as the protectors of the drug cartels. And everybody I respect, I have to get to Colombia this winter to see for myself, but says Colombia is disintegrating. The military is disintegrating. The oil companies are hiring parts of the military to protect their pipelines. Again, the disintegrative factors, and the same ones, ladies and gentlemen, that even worse you find in Mexico, where the cartels are also buying up the Mexican state. The Middle East, it was doing so well with the peace process. You know, I've covered it from 1969 on, and one wonders, I really never expected to see things going that well. Now it has a very, very serious going back. And it's really, really sad because, you know, I was in Israel about a year and a half ago. It was very touching because for the first time you could see Israel was a country among countries in the Middle East. Prime Minister Rabin was alive then. He'd gone to Cairo. You saw Cairo next to Mubarak, next to King Hussein and Arafat. And for the first time, Israel was a country among countries, what the early Zionists always dreamed of. That has pretty much stopped right now. Africa and Bosnia, I'd like to put them together in just for a moment in terms of the ethnic wars. At the end of the Cold War, every new time has a paradigm, and Bosnia was so important because it was a paradigm at the end of the Cold War. It was the, quote, ethnic war, just as Rwanda is the, quote, ethnic war, in quotes though, because, ladies and gentlemen, they're not ethnic wars. They're wars for power on the part of very, very bad individuals like Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia and the former Rwandan president. I could prove to you beyond the shadow of a doubt if we had time that the Bosnian War, the Rwanda War, all the other ethnic wars in Central Asia and in the Caucasus were orchestrated, were plotted, and planned by these sons of bitches at the top. That's very important because it means that ethnic wars are not inevitable, that they didn't spontaneously come up. They're not acts of God, they're not tidal waves, they're not volcanoes. If they can be planned, just like the death of citizenship, which was very deliberately being done in this country, not by bad people, but by people who have different agendas than certainly mine. But if they were deliberate, all these things, then they can be deliberately undone. And they are deliberate, and they can be deliberately undone. So I would say in closing, ladies and gentlemen, that we're at a very, very interesting time. I'm not a pessimist at all. I'm an optimist because I never dreamed that in our lifetimes we would see this country defeat two totalitarianisms, Nazi Germany and the Soviet communism, that we would come out without question as the country of the world. Exactly what our founding fathers dreamed of. The city on the hill is really on the hill. But not unlike other empires at their time of greatest preeminence, they often lose their principles internally. So that was why I wrote this book, and that was what I feel so strongly about. And from there on, it's really up to us. Now, in closing, before we go to questions, I know there's no demand at all for my favorite quotes, but if you'll just stay with me for a moment, I thought I would just mention a couple of them. I was a year or so ago having dinner in Brussels with an elderly Belgian diplomat who had been head of the NATO Council, and he had been a great friend of Churchill. And I said, well, Andre, did Churchill ever say anything to you that he didn't put in his book, some little bit of wisdom? And he said, well, yes, one night we were talking about optimism and pessimism, and Churchill said, Andre, pessimism is the cleverness of the weak, but optimism is the courage of the strong. Then there's another Churchill quote, which I particularly like on courage, when he said, courage is the most important virtue because it guarantees all the rest. Then there's another lovely one by Kierkegaard, whom I really have not read, but I do like this quote. And he said, we can only understand life backwards, but life must be lived forwards. Then in closing, ladies and gentlemen, there is that great quote by John Ruskin, a man beloved of authors, who once said, a book that is worth reading is worth buying. Please.
Can you hold just a second, John, and we'll get the mic with you.
Any guess or opinion on what role we may see Colin Powell following in the next few years?
Do I have to repeat that? No. I would like to see Colin Powell in any number of roles, from the President to the Secretary of State on down. I think he will have to make his own decisions, and I think I know he is such a good family man, and that his wife is absolutely against his taking any position that is too much in the public. She was traumatized by Prime Minister Rabin's assassination, and just is terrified that that the same thing will happen to her husband. Now, I thought if Dole had won this time, that the general would have been a terrific Secretary of State, because he's got that. I think if we had a military man as Secretary of State, particularly him, the military wouldn't be as chary as they are of doing anything. I mean, I was totally against their advice on Bosnia. For instance, they kept telling Bush it would take 250,000 men. It wouldn't take that at all. All we needed to do was back up the Bosnians with air power, which they all know now. I mean, I was in Sarajevo last July talking to them. But having a military man like him as Secretary of State would, I think, straighten out a lot of the fears of the military. But he's a young man. You know, what is he, 58? I mean, he's around there. And he's got time. After all, we had Reagan in 94. Oh.
Will you comment on Castro and the future?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'm glad you, I meant to. You know, I wrote this book on Fidel Castro, Guerrilla Prince, the untold story of Fidel Castro. And of course, he does not like it. I mean, it's a very critical biography. And when the defectors come out, they all call me, and we talk on the phone. I speak Spanish, of course. And I asked one recently, I said, well, what does Fidel think about the book? And he said, oh, he doesn't like it. I said, well, I know that, but what does he not like? And he said, well, the story that goes around is he doesn't like that picture of him without a shirt. And I said, now, wait a minute, because this is a very innocent picture. He doesn't have a shirt on, and he's a little chubby. I mean, he's a great athlete, but he's chubby around the middle, so are a lot of us. And I wrote in there, very innocently, I said, a flaccid Fidel Castro plays ping pong. And that is what he didn't like. I mean, you know, these terrible dictators, they don't care if you say that he killed, 100,000 people, but you say they got a tummy. And that's more than you want to know about that picture, Chris. At any rate, Fidel is never going to be down and out. First, my Cuban friends in Miami have said to me for years, well, he'll be out by spring. And I said, you'll never hear it from me. He could be there 15 years from now. And we have given him a lease on life with the Helms-Burton bill, which is turning us, all of our allies around the world, against us because it's busybody economic foreign policy. I don't believe in economic responses to military problems. And this Helms-Burton bill is just an absolute horror. So what do you see? Fidel was failing. And there he is now marching into the Vatican as though he were a cardinal of the Roman cloth. And he's got a suit on. I almost thought the only thing he lacks is to get married in St. Peter's. And of course, the Pope gives him a certain legitimization, but the Pope also has his own ideas, and Fidel will lose a lot by the Pope going to Cuba. But Fidel is an incredible player in the game of nations, and he's there, and we've given him a second lease on life, and he's going to be there, Chris, as long as he's kicking.
You wrote a column recently about Belarus,
and
saying that was a periphery, and you watched the outer edges of a country. Would you expand on that, please?
Sure. Thank you very much, ma'am. Yeah, one of my philosophies of being a journalist, well, it's something that an instinct, a developed instinct, was you always learn more in the peripheries than you learn in the center. If I want to know what a man is like, I don't go to his home. I go to his mistress's home, because that's where I even go around cities in Washington. I go around the city because I can move a lot faster that way. It's a kind of instinct of life. Belarus is very important because they have the president there, Lukashenko, who's an old Stalinist type, except he's a young man, is bringing back totalitarianism. And he had this referendum this weekend, and of course it passed. And Belarus, White Russia, is right next to Russia. My friend Lebed likes Lukashenko. That's one of the places I would disagree with him on. But it shows the vote in Belarus, whether it was legitimate or not, it doesn't matter. It passed, is a very serious thing because it shows which way, that they can go back again. And that's surely the way they're going.
Would you care to comment on Europe and Japan? I believe you left that out of your expose.
Europe and Japan.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not too up on that right now, sir. You know, I've been working on other things. Surely, as we have withdrawn from Asia, and we are withdrawing. I mean, you go to Asia and our power is just not there. And the Chinese, of course, are like Fidel. They have tremendous instincts for knowing when power is around and when it isn't. But others are coming in. Europe is wooing Japan. Russia is wooing Japan. I think they're about to make some deal on the islands that they took over after World War II. But beyond that, I'm sorry, I'm really not up on investments at this point.
Just stand.
Oh, sure. There's something wonderful going on in Belgrade right now.
Yes.
And would you like to comment on the possible effects it might have
Yeah.
throughout former Yugoslavia?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. Well, there's something wonderful that this gentleman rightly says, is that the Serbian people are rebelling against Slobodan Milosevic, this terrible man who started the wars in Bosnia, orchestrated them for 7 years before he started them. I mean, some accident those were. And I've been so against our policy from the very beginning because this was such an easy war. It was a war of artillery against the cities. Old artillery. I saw it when I was up in Pale in July. I went up with European officers. Everybody says, oh yeah, we should have taken the artillery out. Now they say it. But we have been taking Milosevic's side. First, the UN was taking his side because they believe in this weird, strange neutralism of the UN Charter and not fighting with anybody. And then we came in and wanted Milosevic as our bargaining partner. Nobody else could do it. Well, I am just delighted because I've said all along, and I've had a lot of criticism from particularly SerbNet in this country, which is the pro-Milosevic group, and they're very active and aggressive. And I said in all my columns, I said, these are not all the Serbs that are fighting this dirty war. These are the mountain Serbs and the criminals. And now we see the urban Serbs, which is what I've been saying from the very beginning, are against Milosevic. These are the educated people of the country, and they've now seen their country absolutely run into the dirt. And the final thing he did was he had elections, municipal elections a week ago, and he didn't like them, and so he rescinded them. Well, you know, I wrote on this the other day, and I called Belgrade and I called some of my European contacts and some of our embassies in the area, and they all said, well, they all agreed Milosevic will not use, who knows, it might have happened this morning, but as of 9 o'clock, he had not used the police against them or used the military. And all of them, my sources over there said, because he's no longer sure of them. So it's very reassuring to see the Serbian people against this grotesque man. But it's also terribly sad because we're still on, this administration is still on his side. And one can hardly believe it. They hardly condemned the stealing of the elections. And if we had just had even a slightly different policy, we could have been where we should have been, which is on the side of the Serbian people.
Would you comment on the United States position dealing with Boutros-Ghali?
Oh, yes, yes. I could not have possibly planted better questions. I think this is great. You're just filling in all the areas that I meant to talk about and then didn't. I happen to have had by accident a number of interviews with Boutros-Ghali, Secretary General of the UN. And I like the man very much. I respect him. I don't agree with him on a lot of things. I mean, on Bosnia, we were always he knows that, and we were very frank. But I also agreed with him when he would say to me in New York, he said, well, Georgiana, if the United States didn't want all of these resolutions on Bosnia, then why did their 80-some Why did you not veto the resolutions? Why didn't you give us some guidance? Why didn't you tell me what to do? He would say, I'm a general. You tell me what to do, and I'll do it. And I had to say, okay, that's right. That is right. So on that part, I have to take his side. But since last spring, and I think I actually was the first person to write on this because I interviewed the Secretary General in New York just before anybody really knew what was happening. Warren Christopher, Secretary of State, went to Boutros and said, we're not going to support you for a second term. And then he said, but we may give you one more year. And Boutros's answer to him was, well, if that's a tip, it's not a very generous one. And he told me all the things that happened. For instance, think about this as diplomacy. There was a big Organization of African Unity conference in Cameroon last June. We sent 9 leading diplomats to that, I mean really top people, to tell the Africans, anybody but Boutros Ghali for Secretary General. Well, I said in my column the other day, I said, it's rumored that the ears of the market women in Africa perked up at this. You know, anybody but Boutros Ghali. It's just ridiculous. So now we were defeated for the first time in the Security Council, 14-1, the first time in 51 years of the United Nations, 10 days ago, on Boutros Ghali. Even the Brits, who have never voted against us, they abstained once, voted against us. It's a breathtakingly failing diplomacy. And I've talked to just about everybody up there, and first people thought that it was the Clinton administration's wanting to, last spring, to pander to the Republican Congress because they're against Boutros Ghali. So it was for the election. I bought that at the time. But now it's gotten so complicated. Ambassador Madeleine Albright, someone I respect a lot, is carrying this through like a personal vendetta. And at the time, when in this post-Cold War world, we should be building up the multilateral organizations in an effective way, not the way they were used in Bosnia, but in the way that we see them, in the way that we would show leadership. Instead, we're just tearing the whole place apart over Boutros Ghali. So Chinese have said they'd veto anybody we put up. The African countries are all just as pissed as anything. The French are delighted, they're reveling in it, and they want any French consul general. And their policy is get Clinton and Chirac together in Paris and work it out. You know, typical French diplomacy. So you tell me if this is, if this is a foreign policy.
You didn't comment on the United States' relationship with Turkey. It seems that Turkey can do no wrong, and I'd like to see how you see it in your eyes. Well,
I'm very fond of Turkey. I've always had kind of a soft spot in my heart for Turkey, I think, because they have, in these years, in the last couple of decades, played a very positive role in that part of the Middle East. The Turks would tell you, I have not gone into this a lot recently because I've been working on other things, but the Turks have a kind of eternal idea that we're against them and that Europe doesn't appreciate them and that they're sort of considered the primitive southern neighbor. So the Turks sure don't think that we're, that we're being very kind to them or anything. I do think this administration has probably been better on Turkey than it has on other areas. Everybody in Washington is confused about the Islamic prime minister and what he really wants, although his recent trip to Libya and the trip to Iran made people a lot less confused about it. So at the same time, however, they were hammering out a military deal with Israel, training each other's pilots and stuff. So I think Turkey's still up for grabs. I think it's very confusing. If you had to put me on the spot, I'd say it's not going to be an Islamic fundamentalist state. It's too secular a state. It's too modern a state. But that's where I would be right now.
Gigi, turning your attention back to this country, are you concerned about the fact that fewer Americans have any personal experience in the military, including the elites who run our country, the economic and political elites, and it might lead to sort of a growing separation where one society doesn't really understand the other?
Yeah, this is Professor Williams from Loyola, who's who's a wonderful specialist in these areas. Yeah, I am concerned about it. You know, I think I'm old-fashioned, Jay. I would, you know, if we could have a draft, if we could have everybody serve, sure, that's the way I grew up. And I don't think that is inappropriate to our age. Maybe it's just impossible. But I do, I know much less than you do on this, but I do sense a breakdown of communication between the two societies. I don't have any, you know, special insights into that because I haven't covered that area. But I think we know that the military has done a terrific job in terms of rebuilding itself, in terms of racial integration, and the problems now with women, I think, or the problems are really with the men rather than the women. But these are things I think we're inevitably going to come. That's something that's going to have to be worked through. I'm not surprised that it came, given human nature. You know, whenever I remember our beloved Maury Liebman, and he always talked about human nature, and I've always felt, I mean, if you don't take into consideration human nature, then you get everything all screwed up. That's why I don't like the utopians any more than I like the corrupt other side. And as I said on Washington Week in Review the other night, they were asking us at the end of the show, whither Hillary? And I said, and Ken Bodie started to laugh, I said, well, Ken, I have an adorable little cat. I have the sweetest cat in the world, who's also the most intelligent cat. He's so smart. But I said, you know, no matter how hard he tries, he can't bark. And that was my point about Hillary. Hillary's an ideologue. Accept her for what she is. She's not going to bark. She's going to continue to do what she does. And it's not barking. It's being the ideologue. And that's human nature. Maybe it's cat nature.
Do you see, my question's about Afghanistan. Do you see any relationship between this Islamic government's takeover and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and what do you see as a prognosis for that country?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. They come together simply as factors of breakdown. The Soviet intervention and invasion there, and what was it, 79 already? I think it was. Gosh, you know, it was the beginning. We, and through Pakistan, supported various groups of mujahideen, and they were pitted against one another. The country was all but destroyed then, and this is just another stage of breakdown. But it's hard to see how that country, which I don't know, it's one of the countries I've never been to, but how they can ever pull themselves together again. All their culture, so much of their culture destroyed, the museums, some of the beautiful temples and so on. Beyond that, I think it's just another, one of these breakdown areas that I've unfortunately had so much to do with in covering them.
Do you have a policy for that real government?
Not that I know of, frankly. I mean, the people the desks in the State Department on Afghanistan, you know, they would tell you some policy, but we really don't. There's not much we can do now. Let Pakistan work there. Even General Lebed is very worried about that. Of course, he was in Afghanistan as a paratrooper, so that's another area. The Russians who were in Afghanistan, the Lebed, well, there's only one Lebed type, but those officers, you know, can be heard from again. Lebed was saying that that the Russians must protect Tajikistan and the monuments there in Samarkand because the Afghans were going to come. So it's far from over, but you can't see much congealing at this moment.
And I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about Indonesia, which is now the fourth largest country in the world and going to be, I think, an increasingly important player in world affairs, but specifically in the Asia-Pacific Rim.
Yeah, I was only in Indonesia once. It was, I think, in 1980 on a USIS speaking tour. And I was there a week, and I don't have any special knowledge, you know, of Indonesia. Of course, what we were seeing in the campaign was sort of stunned people awake on what is that there is in Indonesia with 100-some million people and an active, a very active economic life in Asia. I'll be going to Asia probably this winter, so I'll. What we can see, of course, is that the people who are donating money, the Indonesians and people through Indonesians, we're not doing it for nothing. I mean, this brings them a lot of, at the very least, a lot of respect within Indonesia. And now there's more and more coming out in Washington. I don't know what has been coming out in the papers here about how the president's policy toward Indonesia then changed at just the point when he was getting all this money. It's not the first time this has happened. We went through this with the nationalist Chinese, with Israel, with different countries in our history. I am totally against that kind of foreign influence. I don't want it in America in any way, and I'm very worried that these foreign campaign contributions are a new poison.
One last question.
Gigi, I wonder if you favor the expansion of NATO to include Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, at least in the first gulp, and if so, how can this be done without isolating the Russians, or at least making the Russians feel isolated?
Yeah, good question, Dick. I really take sort of a hardline Kissinger position on this, and Brzezinski, that whole group, that we probably should have done it right away. When Russia, Kissinger has made the point over and over, it was better to do it when Russia was weak than to try to do it later when Russia is strong. And I was in Norway last spring, and I was interested in the position of Gro Harlem Brundtland, their then prime minister, and her position. This is from Norway and from a liberal democratic government. She said it's for those countries. It's up to those countries to make up their own mind. If they feel they need this protection and they want to join NATO, they should make the decision on this. I don't believe, Dick, and there's lots of proof of this. I don't believe that the Russian generals and everything are so worried about NATO. I think Lebed has been very honest about this. He said it to us in Washington, and he said it over and over. That he said we have many more serious things to worry about than NATO expansion, and that was when he went into the collapse of the military, the fact they don't have any food for their troops, et cetera, the problem of free-floating nukes and so on. So I think it would have been much better on all levels from when Russia began to change after that interview, that time with Ronald Reagan, to have been very clear about what our interests were, to be respectful of the Russians, be respectful of Russian culture. I mean, I know the way I would have done it. I would have given a speech if I were president. I would have said, the Russian people is a great people. Russian culture is a great culture. And now they, too, are freed from this terrible burden of totalitarianism. And then I would have told the Russians, this is our interest. And I would not have been ashamed to say, we won this war, what Lebed said. And even to have celebrated it without harming the Russian people. I mean, instead, we inserted ourselves, we gave them all sorts of economic help, which has turned out to be devastating for real economic restructuring. And we haven't expanded NATO. Again, I feel the same way about NATO as I felt about, do we need an enemy? Human nature hasn't changed. We still need a security force. We still need these security unions. And I think if we had been very clear about what our interests were and that we were going to do it at a certain time and try to bring them in as much as we could, I think that attitude would have been a much more positive one. Thank you very much.
Gigi, thank you, Gigi, for your outstanding remarks, and also thank all the members of the National Strategy Forum for a superb set of questions. Gigi's available to say hello to you before you depart.